You're a carefree guy who doesn't care about anything in life. However, one day, you are forced by a waifu to teach at an academy where you are quickly labeled as lazy and incompetent. What you don't know is that the future of the empire depends on it. Episode 1. The anime begins with a flashback showing a young boy reading a story about a hero who defeated the Demon King to bring peace to the world. This inspires him to aspire to become a mage defender of justice. The scene then shifts to the present, where we see the city of Fijite, located in the southern part of the Alzano Empire, home to a prestigious institution, the Imperial Academy of Magic. One day, a waifu named Rumia, who happens to be a student at the academy, encounters an old man who is injured and she heals him using magic. However, she asks him to keep it a secret since students of the academy are not allowed to use magic outside of it. Minutes later, a girl named Sistine rushes towards them. On their way to school, they discuss a teacher named Huey who suddenly resigned from his position. He was highly admired by the girls and they hoped that his replacement would be just as kind. When they arrive at the town square, they are surprised by a guy who turns out to be the protagonist. They notice that he is rushing towards them and Sistine uses her powers to push him away. Later, Sistine admits her mistake and apologizes to him. However, when she sees the protagonist behaving mischievously towards Rumia, the waifu sends him flying again. Afterward, Sistine and Rumia finally arrive at class, where they wait along with their classmates for the new teacher. They are a bit anxious since he is taking too long. After a few minutes, the protagonist enters the classroom, leaving the waifus perplexed as he was the same man they had encountered in the square. He introduces himself as Glenn Radars, the substitute teacher, and when he is about to talk a bit about his life, Sistine asks him to start the class immediately since it had already begun. However, the protagonist tells the students to study on their own while he takes a nap. Seeing this, Sistine gets even angrier and hits him with a book, forcing him to do his job. Glenn begins to teach the class, but he does it without enthusiasm and his methods are hard to understand. That's when one of the students asks him a question about what he's teaching, and to her surprise, the teacher says he doesn't know and invites her to find the answer herself, and well, at this point, we realize that the protagonist is quite clueless. Upon hearing this, Sistine gets irritated again and scolds the protagonist for his carelessness, and she blames him for not explaining the lessons that the students didn't understand. But he responds that they should figure it out on their own. Suddenly, the bell rings and he leaves, leaving the students annoyed by his attitude. Meanwhile, we see a teacher named Hallie visibly upset in the principal's office, complaining that Glenn, the protagonist, is not a wizard competent enough to teach at an academy of that caliber. Then the principal, named Rick, explains that he hired Glenn based on a recommendation from Celica, another teacher at the academy. In response, Hallie-sensei starts speaking ill of her, unaware that the waifu was eavesdropping on the conversation behind his back. She then threatens him to retract his words, and the intimidated man leaves the place. Rick asks Celica why she recommended Glenn as a teacher, to which she simply says she wants him to have a good life. On the other hand, we see Sistine complaining about the protagonist, and Rumia tries to calm her down a bit. While enjoying an excellent view, the protagonist suddenly appears. Upon seeing a bunch of waifus in scanty clothing, he tries to apologize, but ends up getting scolded for being mischievous. From then on, Sistine has an ongoing rivalry with the protagonist, to the extent that one day during a class, Sistine can't contain her fury and throws a glove at him as a challenge to a duel. Glenn accepts the challenge and decides to fight her, with the condition of using only one spell. In the end, the waifu easily defeats him. Episode 2. The next day, we see that Glenn continues in his role as a teacher, and as it has become customary, he tells his students to study on their own while he slacks off. Then, Lynn, one of the girls, asks him about magical runes, but Sistine tells her that it's pointless to ask someone who doesn't understand the importance of magic in life. Upon hearing that, the protagonist asks her to explain why magic is so valuable in the world. Sistine talks about the benefits it has for humanity. However, the protagonist disagrees as he believes that other sciences like medicine, agriculture, and engineering are more useful than magic. He also condescendingly tells Sistine and the other students that they are wasting their time because humans use magic to harm each other, in his opinion. Sistine, offended and in tears over what he said, approaches and slaps him. Later, the protagonist recognizes that he made a mistake. In another scene, we see Glenn observing Rumia practicing magic from a distance. He approaches and helps her by adding a material that Rumia had forgotten. Afterwards, he asks her to use the spell again, and as a result, the circle activates and emits a rather attractive light. The protagonist then takes Rumia back to her home. On the way, he asks her why she is so drawn to magic, to which she tells him that some time ago she was captured by dark wizards, and when she was about to be killed, she was saved by an unknown wizard who was a vigilante. She hopes to see him again to thank him. The protagonist observes that the girl seems familiar but doesn't pay much attention. Before saying goodbye, Rumia asks him to apologize to Sistine and explains why she was determined to become a mage. It turns out she wants to fulfill her late grandfather's last wish, which was to discover the secret of the power of Melgalia Sky Castle. The next day, to everyone's surprise, Glenn apologizes to Sistine and starts the class. He begins by calling the students idiots, implying that they don't understand the true meaning of magic. He decides to teach them about Shock Bolt, the most basic technique that students master, as well as the spell that Sistine used to defeat him. Then he starts using variations of the technique, and the students are amazed to see that he can use magic without reciting the spells from a book. He also explains that magic goes beyond memorizing simple enchantments from a book. It involves delving into the heart of humanity. He promises to teach them the basics and invites them to search for what they lack to become true mages. This way, the protagonist starts gaining popularity, even attracting the attention of students from other classes. At dusk, while the protagonist is alone, Celica approaches him and tells him that she now sees him happier and more enthusiastic. She also mentions that she will be attending a conference the next day, so she asks him not to get too mischievous with the girls. In another scene, we see some guys discussing an evil plan they will carry out at the school. Another day passes and the protagonist sensei rushes to the academy but is intercepted by some tattooed men. Minutes later, they infiltrate the class to take Rumia, whom they recognize as Princess Ermiana. Sistine and her classmates try to protect her but are threatened by the bandits who possess military-grade magic, which is a problem for the students. Rumia chooses to surrender because she doesn't want her classmates to get hurt. However, one of the thugs takes Sistine to an empty room to do something inappropriate. But Glenn suddenly enters the room and Sistine suggests he should run away as she thought he wasn't a match for that man. The protagonist approaches and the guy tries to launch an attack, but it doesn't work because Glenn had used one of his techniques to seal magic in a nearby range, an original spell he calls the Fool's World. As a result, he can't use magic either, which amuses his opponent. However, the protagonist engages in a physical fight similar to Bruce Lee and easily defeats him. Impressed by his fighting style, the bandit deduces that he had also taken down one of their comrades. Episode 3. Shortly after, Glenn contacts Celica to inform her that intruders have infiltrated the school and taken some students hostage. He also tells her that it's the work of the researchers of divine wisdom and there's likely an accomplice within the academy. He asks her to go there to help, but she responds that she can't do it immediately because the bandits have destroyed the teleportation magic circle. So he has no choice but to continue fighting alone. As they are about to leave to rescue Rumia, a portal opens and some skeleton creatures called bone golems, summoned by the enemy leader named Rake, start emerging. With Sistine's help, Glenn manages to eliminate some of them, but more keep coming. They are forced to use advanced magic and combine their attacks to exterminate them. However, the protagonist is left very exhausted after that last technique. At that moment, Rake arrives to confront Glenn, so the protagonist pushes Sistine aside to fight him alone. Rake attacks him with his sword magic and manages to land a hit, but Glenn notices that his opponent's prana, similar to mana, becomes unstable before and after using magic. He counterattacks, but his attacks are blocked. Then, Glenn allows Rake to pierce him with his swords as a distraction because he had thrown Sistine as part of a strategy. Sistine enters the scene and uses her magic to nullify Rake's attack. In the meantime, the protagonist takes the opportunity to penetrate Rake with his own sword. Finally, they head to rescue Rumia, but Glenn collapses from exhaustion after the battle. Later, Sistine tries to heal Glenn's wounds with healing magic while he recalls his past. After being unconscious for a while, Glenn wakes up and notices that Sistine has fainted beside him. He then contacts Celica, who provides him with the location of the magic circle. Glenn quickly heads there and finds Rumia being held by the mastermind behind the kidnapping, who turns out to be Huey, the retired academy professor. Huey intends to hand Rumia over because she is a key piece in the organization's plans. He has enclosed her within barriers protecting the magic circle, which he plans to use to transport her to the enemy and then destroy the entire place. However, Glenn is determined not to let his students be in danger, so he tries to destroy the barriers using high-level magic, although it's very challenging. When he almost succeeds in destroying the last barrier, he collapses due to running out of prana. Seeing all the effort Glenn has put in, Rumia reaches through the barrier with her hand and increases the protagonist's power. With this newfound strength, Glenn stands up and destroys the barrier. Finally, he defeats Huey and saves the day. Episode 4. Days after the incident, Sistine and Rumia announced that the Academy was organizing some competitions. Unlike them, who were motivated by the event, their classmates seemed unenthusiastic. They were pessimistic because they felt inferior compared to students from other classes. At that moment, the protagonist enters the classroom and cheers up his students, saying that they can win the competition. Glenn had been observing his students and grouped them based on their skills for the different contests. Later, the protagonist goes to see the director to request an advance on his salary since he has no money, but Rick tells him he can't do that. However, he mentions a special bonus that Glenn can earn as an instructor if he manages to lead his class to victory in the competition scheduled for the next week. The next day, Glenn takes his students to the training field to practice. There, he encounters Hallie, the teacher who had criticized him at the beginning, and asks him to leave with his class. Hallie also tells him that he's wasting his chances of winning by including all his students and not singling out the most talented ones. The protagonist feels a bit offended and challenges him to a bet in which the loser of the competition would have to give up their salary for 3 months. Hallie, quite confident, immediately accepts. Then Sistine intervenes in the conversation, telling Hallie that his claim to the practice field is unjustified and that she will take the matter to the Academy's superiors if he doesn't improve his behavior, as she has influence being of nobility. She also promises that they will have a fair and clean fight in the competition. Days pass and we see the protagonist practicing with his students. In a scene change, Rumia is on the rooftop of her house where she remembers some images from her past when she was rescued by a mage who looks a lot like our protagonist. It turns out that her parents abandoned her 3 years ago and she has been living as an adopted sister to Sistine ever since. Then Sistine approaches her and Rumia tells her that they must give their best effort as the competition begins the next day. They then go inside to have dinner with their parents. Finally, the day of the competition arrives and Queen Alice heads to the city as a regular spectator. She is excited because she will have the opportunity to watch her daughter, and her servant suggests that she change her necklace, to which she agrees. Later, the queen announces the start of the competition. On the other hand, Rumia notices the necklace the queen is wearing and is a bit disappointed to see that it's different from the one she had. Then we see how the students take turns participating in the competition until they reach the 3rd place in the rankings. It's then Rumia's turn and she remains unfazed even though an old man is testing them mentally and a cocky guy from another class tries to intimidate her. However, after the final test, Rumia becomes mentally exhausted and falls to her knees. The protagonist approaches her, resigned, to congratulate her for her tremendous effort and asks her to withdraw. To everyone's surprise, when they announce the cocky guy as the winner, they realize that he is unconscious while standing, making Rumia the actual winner. On the other hand, Queen Alice appears satisfied with having seen her daughter even from a distance. But her servant advises her to be more honest in order to get closer to her daughter. Episode 5. Meanwhile, in the distance, we see 2 guys named Riel and Albert who were assigned to monitor the movements of the Royal Imperial troops because they received information about a traitor near the Queen. During their break, the protagonist complains about being hungry since he hasn't eaten for a while. At that moment, Lin, one of his students, approaches him and asks for some suggestions to improve her transmutation skills. He then shows her an example by transforming into Rumia while recommending that she do some more research and encouraging her for her talent. After Lin leaves, Glenn is approached by Sistine, although he is still in the form of Rumia, so the mistaken girl offers him some food. However, at that moment, the real Rumia appears behind her, and Sistine uses magic to reveal the imposter, realizing it's the teacher, so she sends him flying. On the other hand, the protagonist finds himself somewhere nearby, with slightly blurry vision due to hunger. Later, Rumia goes to meet him and gives him some food that Sistine prepared for him. However, she kept the detail about the food being prepared by the waifu a secret. The protagonist starts eating desperately until he's satisfied. Afterward, Queen Alice approaches them, catching them by surprise. Meanwhile, Zealous, the commander-general of the army, notices that the queen has left without notice. In the meantime, Alice's maid takes the opportunity to whisper something to Celica while Alice is absent. Back with the protagonist, the queen apologizes to him for being expelled from the Mage Corps despite his hard work. Glenn tells her that he only retired because he was tired, and he also asks her why she is there without any of her escorts. Seeing that her daughter Ermiana was present, the queen expresses her longing for her. However, knowing that her mother abandoned her, Ermiana decides not to recognize the queen as her mother and emphasizes that she is Rumia Tingel, not Princess Ermiana. She then leaves the place. Although she felt sad to see her daughter act this way, the queen understood because the incident with Rumia 3 years ago was her fault. Later, when the queen returns, she is intercepted by Zealous, who escorts her with the guards to her destination while Albert watches Zealous's movements through his magical eye. At the same time, Rumia is sitting under a tree looking a bit sad. She is approached by Glenn, to whom she explains the reason her mother abandoned her. She reveals that she is an incarnated demon, accursed and forbidden being born with a special gift that could become a threat to the royal family's reputation. She believes that they got rid of her for the sake of the country. However, she feels conflicted and asks for advice from the protagonist. Glenn tries to encourage her and tells her that she should follow her true feelings. In the midst of their conversation, Imperial soldiers appear and accuse Rumia of conspiring to assassinate the queen, claiming that she will be executed immediately for it, which is obviously a lie. The protagonist asks for evidence, but they only say it's a direct order. When Glenn continues to resist, one of the guards strikes him, knocking him unconscious. They then take Rumia and tie her to a tree. As they are about to execute her, Glenn rescues her with one of his tricks. When they see other soldiers approaching, Glenn takes Rumia in his arms and carries her away from the scene. They hide in an alley where the protagonist contacts Celica for help, but she tells him she can't do or say anything. When he asks her why the situation got out of control, knowing she couldn't answer, the waifu only tells him that he is the only one who can resolve the issue and to find a way to reach the queen. At that moment, Riel approaches Glenn to attack him. Episode 6. It turns out that the queen's servant is also involved in the plot, as she is a member of the researchers of divine wisdom alongside Zealous. She tells Celica that she has placed an enchanted collar around the queen's neck and informs her that one wrong move could cost her life. She explains that there is only one way to undo the curse. As a result, Celica decides not to rush into action for the sake of Her Majesty and the Academy students who were in the midst of the competition. On the other hand, the girl continues her eagerness to fight against the protagonist, but she is stopped by Albert. Glenn, being a part of the Imperial Army's Mage Corps, just like the students, is the reason they know each other well. Albert and Riel also want to save the queen, so they decide to cooperate with the protagonist to defeat Zealous and his group. Meanwhile, Glenn's students are gradually losing their performance in the competition. Glenn and Rumia come up with a plan to get close to the queen. They decide to swap bodies with Albert and Riel through an illusion. By switching places, Glenn and Rumia, disguised as the other students, arrive at the competition venue to cheer on their classmates, though the students don't realize their true identities. As a result, Glenn's class starts to recover and catches up in points with the rival class. Finally, it's Sistine's turn to compete in the last test. When the battle begins, she uses a high-level magic technique and manages to win the match. With this victory, Glenn's class surpasses their rivals in points and is crowned as the competition's winners. According to the rules, the representatives of the winning team are given the opportunity to approach the queen. When Glenn and Rumia stand in front of her, they dispel the spell and reveal their true forms. The protagonist seizes the moment to ask Alice to order an end to all the chaos. However, instead of doing that, the queen orders Rumia's execution and expresses regret for giving birth to her. It's important to remember that Alice is being manipulated by the conditioning spell on the collar. Upon hearing this, Rumia falls into deep sadness. The protagonist wonders what is happening and then remembers that 3 years ago, the queen tearfully begged him to protect her daughter. That's why he believes that the queen in her right mind would never give such an order. Glenn realizes that it may be the cursed collar that Alice is wearing, so he suggests she removes it, but she doesn't. He then rushes towards her, but Zealous knocks him down. However, the plan works as the protagonist expected because the queen is freed from the collar and the curse. In that moment, Queen Alice embraces her daughter tightly while regretting hurting her once again. In a different scene, we see Albert and Riel attempting to capture Eleanor, but she escapes with the help of her magic. Later, they meet the protagonist and thank him for his assistance. Glenn then reunites with Rumia, and as they walk together, she asks him how he figured out that her mother was lying. He reveals the request the queen made to him 3 years ago when she pleaded with him to save her kidnapped daughter, Ermiana. Rumia remembers the promise her mother made that she would always be by her side no matter what happens. Afterward, they arrive at the location where the rest of the students were celebrating, courtesy of the protagonist. What Glenn didn't expect was that his pockets would be emptied so quickly. Episode 7. In the next scene, we see one of the waifus pleading with the protagonist to have compassion for her, and it's not what you have in mind, you naughty pig. The protagonist is training her to enhance her abilities since Sistine had asked him to instruct her because she wanted to protect Rumia. So, Glenn tells her that he will start by teaching her hand-to-hand combat and then give her lessons in military magic, even though it's dangerous for her. However, the protagonist trusts that she can use it correctly without succumbing to darkness. The next day, the girls are on their way to the academy and they come across the protagonist, who is a bit tired from the routine. At that moment, the loli with her unique way of greeting appears. What surprises the protagonist the most is that Riel is wearing the academy uniform. He deduces that she had been assigned as part of a covert operation to protect Rumia from potential threats. Later, Glenn takes the loli to the classroom and asks her to introduce herself to her new classmates. To the protagonist's surprise, Riel reveals her identity as a member of the Imperial Army Mage Corps. Glenn whispers in her ear to correct her mistake. She then says that her dream is to become a part of the Imperial Army and that she is there to learn magic. Seeing how familiar she is with him, the students ask about the relationship between them, to which the loli openly declares that Glenn means everything to her. Afterward, the protagonist and his students go outside to practice magic techniques, where Sistine demonstrates significant improvement in her skills. Glenn praises her for it. Then, Glenn asks Riel to perform a technique in front of her classmates, but since it's not something she's used to, the shock bolt spell goes quite wrong. She then uses summoning magic to bring out a sword and launches an attack that destroys a puppet, which scares her classmates, who start seeing her as a dangerous girl. Despite that, Sistine and Rumia try to get closer to her, and the rest of the classmates, though they find her quite strange, attempt to approach her under Glenn's watchful eye. In a scene change, we see the protagonist meeting with Celica, where he mentions that it seems a bit strange that Riel was assigned to this mission. However, he sees it as an opportunity for the loli to socialize better and hopes that she can learn something on their upcoming field trip. Celica tells him that he is starting to resemble a teacher. Sometime later, the protagonist and his students go on a trip to an alchemy research laboratory, which doesn't excite the kids much. However, Glenn tells them that the ocean is nearby, which would be a golden opportunity to see the waifus in their swimsuits, instantly boosting their spirits in a mischievous way. Later, a vendor offers his items to some of the girls, but the protagonist realizes that it's Albert in disguise. He tells Glenn that he is there because he is the royal guard and warns him to be careful with Riel, as she is dangerous. Afterward, they have fun at the beach, especially the boys who enjoy the eye candy. After playing a game of volleyball, they head to the inn. Here, we see the mischievous boys planning a strategy to sneak into the waifu's room. However, they are caught by the teacher, who takes their plans away, though he doesn't find the idea so bad but sends them to their room. Nevertheless, the boys don't back down and confront the teacher. On the other hand, Riel is surprised to see the protagonist so happy, as she had only seen him as someone mysterious and gloomy when he was part of the Mage Corps. Some time passes and the girls take the loli to the beach to admire a beautiful starry sky, and then they start playing. Riel feels comfortable spending time with the girls, who now consider her a friend. Meanwhile, the protagonist, who is having his drinks, watches them from a distance. Later, when the protagonist is on his way back to the inn, Riel asks him why he left the Mage Corps, and he tells her that he feels a bit guilty about leaving it suddenly. Then the loli tells him that her life has no meaning without him. However, Glenn responds that now he has been able to have fun with Sistine, Rumia, and the rest of the kids. He also asks her to become a student at the academy. Nevertheless, the loli gets angry and tells him that she just wanted to be by his side and reproaches him for Sistine and Rumia pushing her away. In another scene, we see Eleanor talking with a man about the progress of their plan. Episode 8. The next day, as they head to the alchemy research laboratory, Sistine and Rumia notice that Riel has stumbled. When they try to approach and help her, she violently rejects their assistance and starts saying that she hates everyone. She then walks away, leaving the others in astonishment. Glenn explains that the loli is a bit unstable and still upset about what happened the night before. Shortly after, they finally arrive at their destination and are greeted by a man named Birks Blauman, the director of the laboratory. Burks explains that white alchemy is a field that combines white magic with alchemy, a field that deals with life itself, and that's why it's necessary for them to be in a place with constant prana. The students enter a research room displaying some results of experiments in which they used plants and animals to create chimeras. Since most of the objects were animals, Rumia feels a bit sad, thinking that they do whatever they please with them. Later, when Sistine is about to discuss a major project launched by the Empire, Burks interrupts and explains what the project entails, called Revive Life. However, he is interrupted by the teacher before he can go into more detail. The teacher says that Revive Life involves creating a body using alchemy based on the genetic code of the person to be revived, an astral code that relies on the individual's memories, and an alter ether which initiates or restarts someone's spirit. These elements are combined to bring a person back to life. Then, the old man explains that the project is a research that should remain sealed, but he has heard rumors that the researchers of divine wisdom have stolen and successfully completed this research. Confused, Sistine asks him what is needed for the project to work. He tells her that it requires original magic, but the chances of someone with that ability appearing are almost impossible. Later, the girls invite Riel to eat with them, but she is still angry and refuses to join them. Glenn approaches the lowly to try to cheer her up, but she prefers not to listen and runs away from him. When she reaches the beach, she can't hold back her tears. Suddenly, a guy approaches her, claiming to be her brother. Elsewhere, Albert is spying through his magical eye, and knowing it's a deception, he immediately decides to go to the location, but Eleanor appears to intercept him. They engage in a fierce battle of magical power. The waifu uses her necromancer abilities to summon a bunch of corpses to corner him, but Albert doesn't back down and counterattacks. Meanwhile, Riel is very surprised to see her deceased brother. He lies to her, saying that he survived the organization's attack and asks her to save him. He adds that they need to find Rumia, who possesses the power that the organization needs, and hints that Glenn is an obstacle to the mission. The lowly is swayed by the imposter and stabs Glenn with her sword, saying she will live for the sake of her brother, supposedly. On the other hand, amidst the chaos, Albert realizes that they've taken down the protagonist. In Eleanor's case, she abandons the fight upon learning that the plan has been successful. In another scene, Sistine returns to the inn where she hears the sound of shattered glass and rushes to the room. When she arrives, she finds Riel holding her sword and Rumia covered in blood. Seeing this, she is paralyzed with fear, and Riel takes advantage to escape. Shortly after, Albert arrives with Glenn in critical condition and asks Sistine to lend her power for a white magic ritual to save him, as it requires a large amount of prana. When Albert notices that Glenn has stopped breathing, he tells Sistine to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation while he initiates the ritual called Reviver. Meanwhile, Rumia wakes up and realizes that she has been kidnapped and learns that Riel has killed Glenn. Episode 9. In the next scene, Glenn finally wakes up and sees Sistine sleeping next to him. Upon learning that Rumia has been kidnapped, the protagonist becomes angry with Albert and blames him and his superiors for using Rumia as bait to find out the goals of the researchers of divine wisdom. After a brief argument, they both leave to rescue Rumia and Riel. Shortly after, Sistine wakes up and regrets not having done more for Rumia. On the other hand, Burks is with Eleanor and Riel's fake brother, and it turns out that the old man was involved in the kidnapping. They initiate the plan to extract magic from Rumia's body to complete the Revive Life project. Thanks to the tracking magic that Albert implanted in Eleanor, the group locates Rumia, who is in the alchemy research laboratory. Upon arriving at the location, Burks immediately mobilizes his chimeras to attack Glenn and his companion. However, they easily defeat the chimeras. Frustrated, the old man decides to intervene directly to eliminate them. In another scene, Sistine tries to reassure her classmates after telling them what happened. But the kids don't want to just sit idly by and decide to go help their teacher. Meanwhile, Burks encounters the group and transforms into a giant, hideous creature. In response, Albert asks Glenn to go with Rumia while he deals with Burks. We return to Sistine, who manages to convince her classmates to stay and trust the matter in the hands of the protagonist because going with him would only be a burden. Upon reaching the place where Rumia is held, Glenn encounters Riel and her fake brother. He tries to make her understand that the person by her side is not her real brother, but she remains stubborn and starts attacking the protagonist. In response, Glenn pulls out a gun and begins shooting. Then he asks her the name of her brother as part of a strategy. Suddenly, Riel starts to experience a mental collapse while trying to remember the name. Glenn takes advantage of this moment to strike her with the gun and immobilizes her with a magical gravity control technique. Afterward, he destroys Burke's tool and accuses him of being a fraud. On the other hand, Riel begins to remember her past, where we discover that she is truly an artificial human created by the researchers of divine wisdom. The members responsible for this were Shaun Rayford and Rainer Lehner, who attempted to develop the Revive Life project using the genetic code of Shaun's sister, Elucia Rayford. In the past, Shaun was aware of the experiment's dangers, so he turned to Glenn to protect Elucia and Rainer. However, he and his sister would later be killed by Rainer, who refused to abandon the project when Shaun asked him to. Later, Glenn would arrive at the laboratory to find the clone called Riel in a container, and he would be responsible for protecting her ever since. Returning to the present, we see that the person who posed as Shaun was none other than Rainer, who had killed Shaun to steal the experiment's results. Then, Rainer orders some emotionless clones to kill Glenn and Riel. When one of the clones tries to kill the loli, Glenn rushes to save her. Seeing him fight to protect her, Riel gets up and fights by his side, ultimately defeating the clones. When the protagonist approaches Rainer, he points his gun at his head but does it as a joke to scare him. However, he does deliver a good punch. On the other hand, Albert manages to defeat Burks with his fire magic. Later, Glenn returns to the girls and Sistine is relieved to see that they are safe and sound. In another scene, we see Eleanor with a crystal that contains the ritual of the project. Episode 10. Meanwhile, at the beach, the professor is accompanied by Albert, enjoying a beautiful view while watching a bunch of waifus in swimsuits. On the other hand, Eleanor is conversing with an unknown entity she calls the Grand Master, discussing their next move in the plan involving Princess Ermiana. As night falls, the girls take Riel to her house, where she meets the Feibel family, who are Sistine's parents, and notice that Loli is quite shy. Later, the girls go to the rooftop and Riel takes the opportunity to apologize to them and tells them that she considers them her precious friends. The next day, Sistine encounters Celica in the library, who notices the books she's carrying and realizes they were her grandfather's hobbies. Celica encourages her to keep trying. Later, we see her walking through a corridor until she reaches a door leading to an underground labyrinth. Back in the library, Glenn approaches Sistine and asks if she was involved in the ritual they performed when he was on the brink of death, and he thanks her. In this moment, the waifu recalls having to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and blushes. Right then, Rumia and Riel arrive, and upon seeing Sistine's expression, they think the protagonist did something to her. So Riel draws her sword to confront him. The protagonist has no choice but to run while claiming it's a misunderstanding. As he rolls outside, he falls in front of a carriage, and the guy driving it uses magic to push him aside. He then stops and steps down from the carriage, introducing himself as Leos Kleidos, mentioning that he has been invited to the academy as a guest instructor and that he's Sistine's fiancé, leaving everyone astonished. What surprises Sistine the most is that Leos talks about a childhood promise they made to marry when they grew up. On the other hand, in the administrative office, Hallie seems pleased with Leos' presence, as he is considered very promising. Meanwhile, Celica finds his sudden arrival a bit suspicious. In a scene change, we see Leos leading the class as a substitute for Glenn, and he does it masterfully, impressing all the students. The protagonist recognizes his great skill but worries a bit because his teachings were too advanced for their current level. Afterward, Leos invites Sistine for a walk outside, claiming he has something important to tell her. As they walk in the garden, reminiscing about their childhood moments, he proposes marriage, showing he is very serious about it, while the others secretly observe them. Glenn seems excited because things are getting interesting, but Rumia, on the other hand, has a bad feeling about it. However, Sistine rejects Leos' proposal and tells him she wants to fulfill her grandfather's request. Upon hearing this, Leos tells Sistine to forget about her dream, as no one has ever reached the castle in the sky, dismissing it as her grandfather's nonsense. This disappoints Sistine, feeling that he didn't respect her aspirations. Glenn then steps out and accuses Leos of being selfish, but Leos tells him not to interfere in his affairs. Sistine intervenes and pretends that Glenn is her boyfriend, leading the protagonist to play along, hugging her and joking that he had a great time with her the night before. However, realizing he went too far, she kicks him away and reveals they only kissed. This angers Leos even more, and he declares Glenn as his enemy. Glenn challenges Leos to a fight, and Leos accepts before leaving. Later, the protagonist sarcastically tells Sistine that by marrying him, she would become very wealthy and wouldn't have to work, leading her to kick him away again. Later, Glenn tells his students that they will train hard to defeat Leos as he had requested to spar with them as instructors. That night, Glenn meets Albert at a bar, and Albert suggests that he shouldn't compete for a girl he's not in love with. However, Glenn doesn't pay much attention and asks why he contacted him. Albert then reveals that there is a drug called Angel's Powder being smuggled in the capital, which surprises Glenn as he thought it had been eliminated. Knowing that Glenn intends to investigate, Albert asks him not to get involved and mentions the death of Sarah, someone the protagonist was familiar with. On his way home, Glenn remembers his past with Sarah, a waifu who is very similar to Sistine. At the same time, Leos talks to a mysterious man, informing him that the plan went as expected. Episode 11. The next morning, all the students gather in the field for the combat between Leos and Glenn. Hallie dictates all the necessary rules for the showdown and chaos ensues. Leos' class employs high-level military tactics and everything seems to be in their favor since the man had given special training to the students in a short time, allowing them to temporarily take the advantage. However, the protagonist's team doesn't lag behind and starts fighting on par with them as the teacher had taught them some tactics in class. Then, the protagonist begins to taunt the guys from the opposing team to follow him as he had a surprise prepared for them. He had previously set traps in the forest, which we see work because the boys fall into them. The protagonist mocks them and feels great seeing his plan succeed. The fight continues until time runs out and ends in a tie. Glenn is proud that his pupils have competed at the level of Leos' class. Meanwhile, Leos is not satisfied with the outcome and reprimands his class. He challenges Glenn to a one-on-one battle as he refuses to lose the opportunity to marry Sistine for his selfish reasons. But Glenn tells him that he won't give up his chance to marry for money either, which angers Sistine. She slaps the protagonist and leaves, feeling like he is treating her like an object. Later, as the girls are heading back, Rumia tells Sistine that the protagonist probably doesn't have those intentions with her. She adds that even though he has his flaws, he wouldn't be capable of such a thing, so she recommends that Sistine speaks to him personally. On the other hand, we see Albert with researchers finding another victim of the angel dust. In another part, Leos meets the mysterious man again, and they discuss the upcoming duel between Glenn and Leos. Leos is convinced he will win and fulfill his desire to marry Sistine, as he believes he will become the next leader and control the Fibel family. As night falls, Glenn heads to a secluded place and begins to remember Sarah. He is then approached by Sistine, who asks about the girl after hearing him murmur her name. Glenn tells her about a foolish boy, indirectly referring to himself, who dreamed of becoming a hero and decided to study magic. As he grew up and spilled much blood, he began to hate himself and decided to stop being a magician, giving up on his dream. Then the boy met a girl who would be by his side and encourage him to continue pursuing his dream. It turns out that the girl he speaks of is Sarah, but after she was killed, Glenn felt that his life was ruined and began to hate magic. After this, Glenn tells Sistine that he accepted the challenge because he wanted to punish her selfish behavior and because he didn't respect other people's dreams, as he demonstrated when he mocked her. Hearing this, Sistine is happy because Glenn was thinking of her and supporting her dreams. She also thanks him with a smile that reminds her of Sarah. Shortly after, Leos appears and starts taunting the protagonist, pointing out his past and saying that a killer like him didn't deserve to be a teacher. Glenn gets so angry that he decides to challenge him right there. Leos agrees to fight him and immediately uses an alchemy-based technique called tulpa to bring imaginary creatures into reality and use them as weapons. Glenn uses his Fool's Arcana ability, but it has no effect on Leos since he wasn't using magic. Then, Leos attacks him and ends up beating him badly. After being defeated, the protagonist leaves in disgrace. Sistine tries to follow him, but she is stopped by Leos, who threatens to reveal the identities of Rumia and Riel if she doesn't agree to marry him. After his defeat by Leos, Glenn does not meet with the man as they had agreed. In fact, he does not return to the academy for several days. Episode 12. After some time, Rumia meets with her classmates, who were concerned about Glenn's situation. Sistine then informs them that she had accepted Leos' marriage proposal and they would soon be getting married, although it was obvious that she was doing it out of obligation. We then see the wedding ceremony begin, but before it can conclude, Glenn interrupts to take Sistine away. It turns out the reason the protagonist had been absent was because he was preparing to confront Leos. In the midst of their conversation, a horde of Angel's Powder addicts appears. At the same time, Rumia and her classmates, still inside the church, are about to be attacked by other infected individuals. Fortunately, the Mage Corps arrives just in time to save the students. Meanwhile, Glenn decides to use his incredible power to deal with the zombies. Seeing such terrifying power, Sistine feels a bit afraid. Shortly after, Leos appears before Glenn and Sistine. The protagonist then discovers and reveals Leos' true identity, stating that he is actually Jadis Lo-Fan, a former member of the Mage Corps. Jadis changes his appearance and exposes that he used Angel's powder to kill Leos as part of his plan. Glenn asks Sistine to leave to keep her safe. Subsequently, Jadis reveals that he desires to find the Akashic records to obtain supreme power to dominate the principles of the world. After this, a fierce battle between the two begins. The protagonist finds himself in a tight spot as Jadis continues to attack him. When he is pushed to his limits, Sistine appears to assist him. She tells him that, just like Rumia, he is very precious to her and asks him to stay with them and not abandon them. Encouraged by her words, Glenn regains his courage and stands up to continue the fight. They combine their forces to defeat Jadis, who uses his power to create a new element he calls Lady Justice, but it doesn't help much as Sistine keeps it under control. Finally, Glenn delivers a powerful blow to him, causing Jadis to be defeated, although he manages to escape and promises to meet the protagonist again. Afterward, Glenn carries Sistine on his back, and we see Rumia and the rest of the students running toward them, relieved to see them safe. Glenn then asks Sistine if it's okay for him to continue being her teacher, to which she responds that his presence by her side is the answer. The anime concludes with the protagonist heading to the classroom, reciting the words of a story he read as a child, remembering that there are things he wants and must protect, unleashing an infinite power from within him that allows him to rise countless times. Finally, he arrives at the classroom and reunites with his students. If you enjoyed this video and want more great content, please leave the word mage in the comments and I will get to work.